Hello, Brett. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure.
I am a huge fan of the story of stuff, and really excited about the screening that we're going to be doing on Thursday, the virtual screening with a live Q&A with Cara and your co-founder, Annie Leonard. I'd love to find out a little bit more about what the mission is behind Story of Stuff and why you're so passionate about waste and consumerism.
Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you. I'm really glad that you'll be able to share our work with your audience as well. So the Story of Stuff project is based in California in the US, and we are a nonprofit working to transform the way that we make, use, and throw away stuff so that it's more healthy, sustainable, and just. And the need for a reconsideration of what we call our materials economy. So again, where all our stuff comes from and where it goes after we finish using it, really couldn't be more important. We have effectively a linear system where natural resources are extracted to make consumer goods, which eventually become waste that end up in landfills, in incinerators, or in the environment. And that one-way system is fundamentally unsustainable on a finite planet. So we absolutely have to transform that economy into a circular economy. Otherwise, we're just going to start running out of the critical supplies that we need to make our economy go. And we're going to start being overwhelmed by all the waste that we're creating. And then finally, this focus on waste and consumerism provides a really, really excellent entry point, an intervention point to solve a whole variety of conflicts around the way that our society is organized, who it works for, who gets what share of the goods, how we compete for resources between individuals and between countries through conflict. So this relatively apolitical issue that everyone touches is a great way to start talking about much bigger, broader issues that can help us transform our society into one that works for everyone.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And so what area are you focusing on especially?
Sure. So the Story of Stuff project works on storytelling and campaigning. So we tell stories by creating online videos and other types of content that really help people connect with the types of issues that I just introduced and understand some solutions and, most importantly, pathways to change. And then we also pair those stories with campaigns to provide people opportunities to make change at a systemic level to transform our society in the ways that we need. We have a real focus on two issue areas, one being protecting public water. There are companies, multinational corporations like Nestle, for example, that'll come into small towns, they'll create a bottling plant, they'll suck up that town's water, often paying nothing more than the same well permitting fee that you or I might pay for our home, often a couple $100s a year, to extract millions of gallons of water, package them in plastic, ship them around the country. And of course, those very quickly become waste that can not be recycled very effectively. So protecting public water, ensuring that people have access to cheap or affordable, clean, safe drinking water, the one thing that all of us need to survive, is one of our campaign areas. And then we're also working on plastic pollution. And just this past Earth Day, April 22nd, last week, we released our first feature-length documentary, The Story of Plastic, which is really our effort to dramatically change the way that we think about plastic pollution. And I know we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But we've paired that with a variety of campaign interventions to try and do our part to help contribute to this broad global movement working to create a future without plastic pollution.
That's brilliant. And because water is something that so many of us take for granted, and yet it's isn't it going to be like the kind of source of like most conflict in the future? Is that what's being said?
Water is something that's it's critically important that we ensure that folks have clean, safe access to it. Something so fundamental that all of us depend on, and a resource that is fundamentally shared among all of humankind. The water cycle is global, it moves rather rapidly. I think points to the dramatic need to ensure that this is something that we all have access to. We think that it's pretty gross, frankly, for water to be treated as a commodity product that can be sold for profit. And all too often, we're seeing corporations come into cities, often cities that are struggling, cities that have failed to invest in protecting their water supply, often due to conservative policies of austerity, which deprioritize investment in replacing pipes, for example. And these corporations will say to the city, we can take care of this. Let the efficiencies of the free market, ensure everyone has safe drinking water. Unfortunately, then these cities will often then turn over the keys to their public water supply, and these corporations will then privatize them, and they will raise the rates as much as possible to extract the maximum value, and often fail to make good on their promise to replace aging infrastructure. So too often we're seeing that this supposed solution to water issues in cities really just further exacerbates the problem. So we think that this is a really critically important area for us to be focusing on to ensure that everyone has access to clean, safe drinking water.
And like looking at our issues of waste and consumerism through the lens of water is really insightful because, for example, when we think about something like fashion, the amount of water that goes into creating a cotton t-shirt or a pair of jeans is so almost unimaginable. I can't remember the exact figure of it, but I mean, it's a vast amount. And the same, with the meat industry as well. So it like looking at it from the perspective of water really kind of allows us to understand like the social justice issues, but part of the social justice issues behind the waste crisis that we're currently facing.
That's exactly right. Yeah, water is really another great lens, just like waste, into our consumer economy. And particularly it connects with this idea of pace, that within natural systems, everything has an appropriate pace that it moves at. And for water, that's dictated by the constraints of geology, of soil absorption rates, of the needs of our natural ecosystems. And yet we have an economy that moves so fast. And, as we pave over huge areas, we cause water to run off into these big rapid racing channels that can eat away at our soil bases. So we have a system that's fundamentally misaligned with the basic constraints of nature, and water is really one way that is revealed quite dramatically.
And the story of stuff. So I've been reading Annie Leonard's book, The Story of Stuff, and the book is structured kind of looking at the materials economy. So it starts with extraction, production, distribution, consumerism, and then disposal. Correct me if I got that mixed up. Could you unpack that a little bit with me? So just kind of how the journey of the material economy and how this linear approach needs to be replaced with a more circular approach.
Yeah, exactly. So when we go out to the store and we buy, say, a new clothing item from the local fast fashion depot, or a packaged snack from our local corner store, we really don't think much about where that product and the materials that it's composed of come from, and ultimately where it goes when we throw that packaging away. And Annie's original video, The Story of Stuff, which was one of the first cause-oriented viral videos released in 2007 on the then baby YouTube, and then, of course, followed up with her book by the same title, The Story of Stuff, which expands a little bit more deeply into the issues raised in that film. It's an issue to really pull back the lens and move away from the micro focus on, litter in the environment, for example, and look at the holistic ecosystem, the whole system of our materials economy, and really understand, to take that single use, chips wrapper, where does this come from even before it's plastic? Let's look at the wellhead where this is where the fossil fuels that compose this plastic are extracted. How are communities around that area impacted? What are the consequences and the costs of the production of those material goods? What about the ways that it's shipped around the world, the country? What are the consequences and the environmental costs of that? How do the ways that we interact with those products affect culture and society? How does marketing and advertising that creates demand for these items change the way that we think about ourselves and each other and determine the way that we've structured our society and the objectives that we're all pursuing? And then finally, after we toss an item away, well, there is no away. It's going to go somewhere. It's going to end up in a landfill in someone's backyard, or being burnt in an incinerator that causes air pollution, or it's going to end up washing out to sea and smothering some animal. So it was really an effort to pull back the lens and link these seemingly disparate struggles together, such that people that are working upstream, on anti-fracking, and people that are working downstream on anti-incineration can connect these issues that may have been disparate in order to build bigger coalitions that can, work with one comprehensive, unified vision for a just and sustainable future instead of, separate, disconnected struggles.
I love that so much. And I think such an inhibitor to us creating the change that we need to be able to create is this feeling that everything's kind of separate. So the very fact that the government would have an environmental sector as though that that's a kind of small part of like kind of human existence, when in fact almost everything that we do has an environmental impact, because we live on the earth. And I really love that the huge emphasis that Story of Stuff has on story, because when we come to consume things, we just have most of the time, we're kind of acting off this impulse, this like desire, and we don't really know where that desires come from. We don't really question it. We don't really question why we're buying it or who's telling us to buy it and where has this product come from? What's the story behind it? There's hundreds of hands that have gone into creating something before it actually ends up on our shelves, let alone, the journey that it's going to go on once we've kind of done with it. And as you say, there is no way. So I really love that, because I think it's fundamental to us being able to transition towards more mindful way of being, when we can really connect with the story of where things have come from, and really start to value the stuff that's in our life instead of seeing it as disposable. I mean, there's nothing, humans are the only creature on earth who've actually created waste, and the fact that we have such a materials economy that's so based on disposability is just kind of insane.
It sure is, yeah. And as I say, I mean, it is just fundamentally unsustainable. So as we often say, we must change, and we're going to change either by design or by disaster when we go over the edge. And frankly, unfortunately, I think it'll be a little bit of design and a little bit of disaster, because these things are unequally spread. So now is when we're going to determine what the generations to come will be left with in terms of the resources that they have access to and the messes that they have to clean up. And then finally, as you say, we don't really have much of a relationship with our things, and too often we don't think about who pays the cost for our cheap and convenient lifestyle. So the fact that you or I can so easily go into a store and buy a cheap chips bag or, cheap plastic electronics, well, that's because the true environmental cost of those items is externalized to communities that we often don't see. So the price of our cheap electronics is paid by, communities upstream in the Houston shipping channel, where they have double the national average of childhood leukemia rates because they're exposed to the toxic byproducts of chemical production. Or it's paid by, folks in the developing world who will ultimately get all of that electronic waste when we're done using it. We'll melt it down. We'll melt down the circuit boards over open fires to get the gold off and then pay the price there. So the costs of our products are high. They're just being hidden from us. And I think that it's up to all of us to bring that cost down and to make sure that they are borne by people that, consent to taking that on.
Yeah, it's going to be, it's such a fundamental part of the solution, is being able to kind of acknowledge and like internalize those externalized costs. Mm-hmm. Is that actually possible to do that within our economy?
Well, that's a great question. It's a big picture change, right? It's a big and very fundamental change, but it is the type of fundamental question that we need to be asking. And I think they can be approached through mechanisms like GDP, or gross domestic product, which was intended to measure all of the economic activity of a country. The problem is that that's a very one-dimensional metric. So it measures the cost of cleaning up an oil spill the same as it would measure the economic activity of building a solar plant. It measures the economic activity of building a private prison the same as it measures the economic activity of building a library or a school. So I think that we need to figure out new ways of measuring what we value and how we price the impacts of things.
Yeah, that's a huge point. For us, the very fact that we can kind of measure our success as a nation and our development and progress by doing things and living in a way that is inherently at odds with the natural world is just a kind of it's a suicidal system, really.
Right. Yeah, it's that we're hiding the true costs. We're drawing down against our stockpile of natural resources because we're depleting them faster than they can replenish. Some replenish, slowly, but too slowly for the pace at which we're consuming them, and some, like fossil fuels, for example, don't replenish in any meaningful human timescale. And so right now it feels like things are going just fine. But that's because we're drawing down against that stockpile. So it's like if you were, going out to the store, every other week, but you were eating all the food in your pantry far faster than you're replacing it, you may feel like you're getting a good meal every day, but ultimately you're going to hit a wall. And I think that that's the experience that we're going to start to have, honestly, likely within our lifetime and certainly within the next few generations if we don't dramatically change things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Story of Stuff does a really good job at kind of shifting the attention away from the consumer as an individual and more towards institutions. And I know this is a fundamental part of the new documentary as well, The Story of Plastic. I'm really fascinated by the relationship between individual action and systems change and how these two interact. And like you were saying earlier, with the kind of the mission behind The Story of Stuff with the film and the book, it's about stepping back and looking at the whole rather than just, about people littering. It's about understanding where things have come from and where they're supposedly disposed of. I'd love to, hear your thoughts on the relationship between the individual and more systemic change.
Absolutely. So we're so often told that it's up to each and every one of us to do the right thing, to shop green, to vote with our dollar. And really that dominates the ecological conversation in much of the country. Now, of course, every single one of us should minimize our unnecessary plastic, should make sure that we're properly sorting our recyclables, that we are reducing what we consume, reusing those items that we do, that we're bringing our reusable mugs and our reusable shopping bags. That said, that is a great place to start, but it's an awful place to stop because, frankly, we live in a society that is designed for consumption and disposal, and it makes doing the right thing really, really hard. And unfortunately, we're just never going to get everyone to make all of the right decisions in those ways. So instead, what we need to do is to take collective action to change the system so that doing the right thing becomes the easy thing. It becomes the default thing that people just do without having to think about it. So we have to change the tide so that, people that are making green decisions aren't swimming upstream, because ultimately more important than a decision about what you take off the shelf in the store is the decision about what gets put on the shelf. What are the options available to you? What is more accessible? What do people default to doing? So yeah, we absolutely encourage people to bring your reusable mug, but look for ways that you can scale up your action. So in addition to bringing your reusable mug, can you have a conversation with the coffee shop that you go to and encourage them to put up a poster reminding people to bring their reusables, or offer a discount, or even stop providing plastic at all. And then finally to lobby our elected officials and corporate leaders to ensure that they are making the right option the easy option for everyone.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, with the EcoResolution, for example, we started as a campaign of pledge making, just wanting to increase the conversation around, taking action and the empowering people to make those changes within their own life. But then, a few months in, we were reflecting and we were like, actually, this is all off. Our messaging's off. And we relaunched in January, going more on like a journey of climate action. So each month kind of really delving deeper into topics to see how can we scale up our actions? How can we go further than just stopping using straws and using a reusable cup? Because that's not going to change the system which we're embedded within. And also, I think that a lot of people kind of want to get really involved. They just don't really know where to start and how to scale up. So it's an exciting time. Yeah, we've been deprived of the vocabulary. I think you're exactly right to note that it can feel intimidating for a lot of people because, first of all, the problem is so large, and because for so long we've been told shop with your dollar. We've been we've had this consumer muscle, grown and grown and grown, and it come at the cost of our civic muscle. So often I'll have conversations with people where I talk about what some of the solutions to the plastic crisis are, for example, or I'll talk about the plastic crisis, and somebody might say, well, how do we fix it? And then I'll talk about the solutions, and then they say, but how do we do that? And so you have to remind people that, well, we have to, vote and hold our elected officials accountable, and, call, email, and, fax and write to them and show up at their office and, sign petitions and attend rallies and attend meetings and organize in your city to pass municipal bans and so on. So I think it's incumbent on groups that are working to make change in this way to
really facilitate change-making activities among the community, to really have conversations about how we build and grow people power and how we encourage people to step back into that role as change makers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Before I move on more towards the story of plastic, I'd love to hear a little bit about what are the solutions that are presented in a more institutional level, within the narrative of the story of stuff. Like, how do we address our waste and consumerism challenges?
Well, the spectrum of solutions are as big as the problem itself. Certainly pushing for cultural changes that invite all of us to reconsider the things that really make us happy, to have conversations within our schools, at our dining room tables, about pursuing right relationship with ourselves, with nature, with one another, as opposed to acquiring more consumer goods, thinking that that will make us happy. It's about making structural changes to how we fund elections and how we engage with our elected officials, pulling back the corporate power to fight for effective democracy, where people's voices rise above corporate influence on our elected system. Things like term limits and public funding for elections can be part of that as well. And it's fighting for real corporate accountability, for real consequences for corporations that pollute our environment or abuse human rights. It's fighting for dignity for workers. It's fighting for a green economic grid. So this is a big issue, and that means that there's a lot of places to jump in. We need all types of change at every level. We need all hands on deck. So there are a lot of ways to make change. It doesn't need to look like locking yourself down to a bulldozer at a pipeline fight. Making change can mean, baking cookies for the local green group and bringing it in to support and feed the volunteers. It can mean, convening a discussion in your living room for a conversation about activities. It can mean, a letter writing campaign. So there's a million ways for people to plug in, regardless of what your appetite, your skills, your talents, your availability, your capacity are. There's a role for everyone in this fight, and we need everyone on board.
I love that you brought that into the conversation, because I think that so often, like, being an activist or wanting to get involved with environmentalism and ecological action seems so intimidating and alienating. I know I felt that for ages, just kind of felt too nervous to get involved and didn't know where to start, and didn't feel like I wanted to be kind of shouting on the street, but then felt too scared to go to the groups as well. So I think it's so important for, us to really bust open what it is to kind of start working towards a world that thrives, and show that it's, there's so many different ways in which we can come together and start to create positive change.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And frankly, it's difficult for people to take environmental action when they're worried about putting food on the table or finding, childcare for their kids. So fighting for paid family, maternity and paternity leave, and sick leave, and, good, pre-K and, K through 12 public education, these are all mechanisms that may not explicitly be environmental issues directly, but these are all ways that we can move our society more broadly towards, a just and sustainable future. So, it doesn't need to explicitly be, a strictly green issue, but fighting for, a more just society where more people have the space and the bandwidth and the opportunity to engage as real, citizens, as opposed to just consumers that are constantly trying to make ends meet. These are opportunities for change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to really kind of embrace solidarity within all different movements that are all fighting for justice, because this is all interconnected very deeply. I'd love to find out about the story of plastic and kind of what ignited your organization to start working on this film.
Absolutely. So the story of plastic is our first feature-length film. It was released on Discovery Channel on Earth Day on April 22nd. Globally, I believe it aired in the UK on the evening of the 22nd. Folks can still watch the film on Apple TV, on Xfinity On Demand. It's for rent on Amazon. But the way that we really encourage folks to connect with the film is by hosting a free virtual community screening. These are events that can be organized and attended from the safety of your home. So even if you're sheltering in place during the pandemic, it's a great way to connect with the film, to share it with your community, and to engage people in conversation and action. Now, the intention behind the film is much like the intention behind the story of stuff video as a whole. It was an effort to pull the framing back in the conversation around plastic and move it away from the focus on what we call ultra-charismatic marine mammals. So things like, the dolphin with the turtle, or rather the turtle with the straw stuck in its nose, or, the whale with the stomach full of plastic. These are obviously critical environmental issues that do deserve our attention and, frankly, our outrage. But the environmental impacts of plastic go well beyond plastic's end of life in the ocean and the environment. As I mentioned earlier, 99% of plastic is a petrochemical created from fossil fuels. And increasingly, it's created from fracked natural gas as a result of the fracked gas boom in America. And the communities that live near these wellheads or near the facilities where this plastic is produced, they bear the cost. Plastic, when we consume and interact with it, can release a number of chemicals that are dangerous for us. And then ultimately, plastic, once we dispose of it, only 9% of plastic ever produced has been recycled, and only a fraction of that has been effectively recycled, meaning it's been recycled into something of equal or approximately equal value. The majority of plastic just gets downcycled. So, high quality plastic water bottles might become fleece, but the majority of other lower grade plastic will ultimately just become, like curbside bumpers or playground equipment or something of a lower value. You can't make a water bottle into another water bottle into another water bottle. And then finally, in addition to that low rate of recycling, a huge amount of plastic is getting incinerated, causing really toxic pollution problems, and increasingly it's being exported to countries in the developing world. The majority of our plastic used to go to China for recycling. We don't have much of a domestic plastic capacity in the US or in other countries in the global north. And when China shut its doors to our plastic waste with their national sword policy in 2017, it started a race to the bottom, where all of a sudden countries were exporting that waste to whatever other countries in the developing world were willing to take it. So you saw this huge surge of exports to countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, which didn't really have a particularly developed recycling infrastructure. And so you were seeing these ad hoc industries popping up with no environmental controls, no worker protection controls. So the story of plastic really was an effort to pull that frame back, to look at the impact of plastic across its entire life cycle, and then finally to assign blame. As I mentioned, industries have really kept the focus on plastic in the environment, and they've blamed individuals. They came up with this whole myth of the litter bug. There's groups like Keep America Beautiful, which were funded by the American Chemistry Council, the advocacy organization created by many of the big plastic players, both the petrochemical producers themselves and then the consumer goods companies that are producing and distributing all these items. And they want us to think that all this plastic in the environment and in the ocean is the responsibility of irresponsible consumers. And if only we had the perfect waste collection system. But really, this isn't a waste management problem. It's an unmanageable problem. There's just too much plastic, and too much of it is low or no value. It just can't be recycled, and there's nowhere else for it to end up. So we're really trying to show the whole picture, the whole story of plastic, but also point the blame and say ultimately it's the big plastic industry. It's the petrochemical producers and the consumer goods companies that are the ones that need to take the lead on the solution. And the first thing we need to do is just reduce the amount of plastic that's entering our economy, so that we can bring it down to a manageable level to start with.
Yeah, wow. And do you think that that those kinds of like institutional systemic changes are going to occur or could occur? Where do the kind of petrochemical companies stand on this right now?
So the petrochemical companies, see plastic as a lifeline. As the fracking boom in the US in particular has increased the availability of cheap fossil fuels and increasing decreasing energy demands and increased energy efficiency, or decreasing the amount of oil and natural gas that is being used for energy. They need somewhere to put all of this, fracked natural gas liquids. So the plastics really represent a lifeline. So it's become a problem that's not driven by demand for plastic so much as supplies of cheap fracked natural gas. Now, we know that the oil and gas companies, these are corporations, right? These are not people. They are corporations that are legally bound. They have a fiduciary obligation to maximize profit. So they're going to continue to do what they're going to continue to do with no regard whatsoever for the environmental consequences. Ultimately, though, these are heavily subsidized industries that would not be profitable were they not receiving literally hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies in the US alone at the municipal, state, and federal level. So one big intervention point that we can take advantage of is simply removing fossil fuel subsidies and imposing more strict environmental controls to reduce the amount of virgin plastics entering the economy. At the same time, we can pair that with supply side interventions like recycled content standards, requiring that new plastics, particularly low and no value single-use plastics, have at least a minimum threshold of recycled content, and this would increase the market for recycling for the recycled plastic and decrease the amount of virgin plastic being put into it. So that is one starting point where we can really change the story. But it's important that we make sure that we are focusing on who's to blame at the beginning of the cycle and not looking later down the line where many of these environmental consequences, human and environmental health consequences, have already been felt.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is the story that the kind of big plastics don't want to be being told, right? And that's kind of the mission of the film, to kind of showcase and highlight that narrative, which is so often not explicitly told. Instead, it like you say, the responsibility comes down to consumer, like the shameful, guilty consumer who bought the plastic in the first place.
Yeah, these companies really have some very shady practices, in taking the EU, for example, where there's quite strong extended producer responsibility requirements. In those areas, companies are required to pay into the recycling systems and waste deposit schemes. And in those areas, then, you'll see relatively recyclable hard plastic bottles. And then, they have this whole song and dance about how green and sustainable they are. We pay into systems because we care. Well, these very same companies will be marketing these exact same products in countries in the global south in single-serving, non-recyclable, multi-layer packages. So in the very communities where they're not required to pay into these deposit schemes, they're creating products that can't be recycled because they're not being held accountable. So they really are, it's a shell game, effectively. They want to point the blame at you as an individual consumer. They want to say how good they are, in the areas where, you or I might see it. Whereas, in other parts of the world where they have no accountability, they're continuing to do, whatever they can to maximize their profits with no regard for the end of life of those products.
Yeah. Wow. I'd love to pick your brains a bit on like what the vision is. Because so like something I feel like wary of is that all resources on this planet are precious and finite, and we must be so like, the issues that we're facing isn't just, the plastic or not plastic, it's the amount that we're consuming and the amount that we're producing. What would you say is the vision, like the kind of the story of plastic and the story of stuff wants to be working towards? Would it be changing the materials in the material economy, or would it be closing the loop, or Yeah,
absolutely. So I can answer that in two different ways. The first is the kind of general big picture, soft and squishy vision. And then the second is to talk a little bit more specifically about the actual system itself that would underpin that. So the first, the vision, is, in short, that we transition away from a society that is focused on more, and we instead focus on that we transition away from a society focused on more and instead work on creating a society focused on better. So instead of just accumulating more stuff, more wealth, more goods, more consumption, faster, how can we focus on better relationships with one another, with ourselves, with the natural world around us? How do we focus on an economy that prioritizes human flourishing and beauty and art? And it sounds abstract and a little, woo-woo environmentalist. And frankly, I think that's fine. But I think it's important for us to imagine, what would such a world look like? How do we prioritize relationships and activities and experiences over consumption? Now, in terms of what that looks like from a systemic perspective, we are not trying to ask people to go back to living in caves and hunting and foraging and, give up their iPhones and, light candles again.
Sounds quite nice, though.
It does sound quite nice, frankly. Yeah, I think we could all use that from time to time. But it's about, rearranging the way that our materials flow throughout our economy so that it does flow in that loop system. So it looks like, zero waste collection, making sure that everything that moves through our economy can either be composted or effectively recycled, and that nothing just gets wasted at the end. The organic materials should all get composted and turned back into local agricultural outputs or local agricultural products or renewable inputs for bio-based materials. Meanwhile, all the other things that we consume and ultimately dispose of either need to be able to be effectively recycled or reused and repaired. So that can look like, instead of, buying a new iPhone every year and thinking that you're inferior if you have the older iPhone, designing products that can be repaired and last for years, and so on. So yeah, these are big picture changes, and I think that the transitions are going to be applied in so many areas of the way that we organize a society and so many of the objectives that we pursue. But again, it's a change that we do need to apply, and it's one that there's an opportunity for everyone to take part on at every level.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think it's so important for us to, collectively hold on to a vision together. It's so easy to get, really upset, depressed and anxious about, plastic and, our consumerist productionist economy. But if we can't hold a vision of actually where we want to go, our actions are going to be quite stunted, because they're just going to be fighting against something and shifting from that feeling that we're fighting always against something and more towards building something that we actually want to be living in can really sustain our action without burning out. Yeah. I would love to ask you one question. I don't know if you've got time. One more question. Yeah. So I'd love to ask you, what gives you hope in all the work that you do? What's really sustaining you? What are the changes that you're seeing that really that inspire you to keep going forwards?
So there's a couple of things that give me hope. The first is that we have an increasing global movement, particularly in the area of plastic, that is working to unify our efforts with a connected global strategy under the banner, plastic space, under the banner of the movement, under the banner of the Break Free from Plastic movement. So folks can visit breakfreefromplastic.org to learn more about that space. And it's over 1,600 groups all around the world now that are making sure that the folks working on the beginning of tailpipe, resource extraction, petrochemical issues are in conversation with the folks working on end of life, waste disposal, global waste trade, and so on. So we can present a unified front against some of these corporations that are responsible for these issues. So that gives me a lot of hope to see, a growing sense of global solidarity in an effort to link up strategically to build people power. And then the second thing that gives me hope is, as I say, we will change by design or disaster. And I think it's going to be a little of both. And just knowing that, everything that we do, every new law that we pass, every conversation that we have, it's going to move that line a little bit more. It's going to make that positive, hopeful future accessible to just a few more people. Ultimately activism like this, particularly big systemic activism, it is not a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a relay race. It's a multi-generational effort. So we just passed the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. 50 years on from now, on the 100th Earth Day, I feel pretty confident and quite optimistic that the generation to follow, and you and I, hopefully still kicking at that point, will see the fruits of our labors and know that there's another generation of change makers who are raring to continue that work.
Yeah, thank you. That's something that really sustains me as well, to know that, engaging in the environmental movement and working to co-create a world where people and planet can thrive together is not something that started a few years ago. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and this, linking back to what we said earlier on, it's about solidarity with all justice movements. And I feel like that intergenerational connection that you can have by understanding that this isn't a linear thing. This is like a movement that's been going on for forever, and I'm sure will continue forever as well. But I too feel very positive about what 50 years from now. Design or disaster. So thank you so much, Brett, for joining me. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you, and I'm really excited to be hosting one of the screenings on Thursday of The Story of Plastic.
Pleasure to speak with you as well. I'm so grateful that you'll be able to share the story of plastic with your community. Certainly invite everyone to check out our work by connecting with The Story of Plastic online or on social media, or with The Story of Stuff Project, rather. We're at Story of Stuff on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. You can visit our website at storyofstuff.org, and then again, connect with The Story of Plastic by attending your screening, or visit storyofplastic.org to learn more about other ways to watch.
Brilliant. Thank you.
My pleasure. Great to speak with you.